The Wyoming sun blazed merciless and white-hot in the cloudless August sky of 1876, baking the dirt streets of Cheyenne into cracked hardpan. Dust devils danced between weathered storefronts as townspeople gathered in an uneasy circle, their boots stirring up clouds that hung motionless in the stifling air. Men removed their hats despite the brutal heat, eyes downcast, studying the intricate patterns their worn boot tips traced in the parched earth. Women pulled children close, covering young eyes with trembling hands. In the center of this human arena stood Sarah Miller, arms wrapped protectively around her half-naked body. Her torn calico dress hung in tatters around her waist, the fabric shredded by rough hands and rougher intentions. 28 years old, her wheat-colored hair was now streaked with tears and dust, her face sunburned and etched with lines of grief that hadn't been there 3 months ago when she'd buried her husband. 3 months a widow, 1,000 miles from the Boston drawing rooms she'd once called home. Look at her. The voice cracked across the town square like a bullwhip, sharp and commanding. Ezekiel Grayson sat astride his black stallion, a man in his 60s, with a silver beard that caught the harsh sunlight and eyes like winter storms, hard, cold, and utterly without mercy. The former Confederate colonel's left sleeve hung empty below the elbow, pinned neatly to his immaculate black coat. The wound from Gettysburg was a badge of honor he wore with fierce pride, a reminder of all the war had taken from him and all he intended to reclaim. This northern woman, he continued his cultured southern accent, lending false civility to words dripping with venom, thinks she can claim Wyoming soil that rightfully belongs to those who understand this territory's true nature. Flanking him on matching chestnut horses were his sons. Elijah, 35, bore his father's features, but harder meaner his face, a mask of casual cruelty. A cavalry saber hung at his side, despite the war being over. These 11 years, some men never stopped fighting. Noah, 30, was younger, softer somehow, with something in his dark eyes that might have been shame, as he stared at the cloudless sky, unable to meet Sarah's desperate gaze. "My husband's land is mine by right." Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her humiliation. The words came out stronger than she felt, born of desperation and the stubborn pride that had sustained her through William's drinking, his violence, and finally his death. "The deed is legal and filed with—" The crack of Elijah's gloved hand across her mouth cut her words short, splitting her lip and sending a spray of blood onto the dusty ground. The metallic taste filled her mouth as she struggled not to fall. "Your Yankee husband." Ezekiel spat his voice, rising to play to the crowd. "Came here with northern ideas and northern weakness. He died as he lived of a disease with no backbone to fight it." His remaining hand gripped his reins until the leather creaked. "Wyoming isn't for the weak, Mrs. Miller. This territory demands strength, and you have none." Sarah tasted copper and earth as she fought to stay upright. William Miller had been many things, a drunk, sometimes cruel a man, who dragged her west with golden promises that turned to alkali dust. But he'd been her husband. Their life together hadn't been the love match she'd dreamed of as a girl reading romantic novels by her father's fire, but it had been hers. And now the Graysons were stripping that away, along with her dignity, piece by bloody piece, of that land. Ezekiel continued his voice, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Sits at the headwaters that feed my cattle. It's been Grayson water rights since we arrived in '66. Your husband knew that when he falsely claimed it. The town sheriff, a perpetually squinting man named Dawson, with a tarnished star pinned to a vest that barely contained his considerable belly, cleared his throat nervously. "Colonel Grayson, there's legal ways to dispute property. We are the law in Cheyenne." Elijah shouted, his hand dropping instinctively to his saber hilt. The sheriff fell silent, backing away with the hurried steps of a man who valued his pension more than justice. Sarah felt the world narrowing to this moment, this circle of shame and helplessness. She'd come west with dreams of a new life, fleeing a Boston that had become unbearable after her father's financial ruin and subsequent suicide. William Miller, a Union veteran with a charming smile and stories of golden opportunities in the Western Territories, had seemed like salvation itself. She'd discovered too late that his charming smile vanished behind closed doors, that his hand was quick to anger, that the bottle was his truest companion. His death from fever should have freed her. Instead, it had left her more vulnerable than ever to men like the Graysons. "I'll not leave my home," she said, straightening despite her near-nakedness, finding strength in defiance. "Not for you or any man." Ezekiel's weathered face twisted in disgust. "You'll leave one way or another, Mrs. Miller. The question is whether you walk out of this territory or get carried out in a pine box." He nodded to Elijah, who dismounted with practiced ease and uncoiled a length of rawhide from his saddle, the kind used for breaking horses. And Sarah realized, with growing horror, disciplining slaves on the plantations these men had lost to Union victory. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one moved to help. The Graysons controlled the water rights, the cattle trails, the freight contracts. Crossing them meant economic ruin in this unforgiving land, and everyone present knew it. As Elijah approached with the rawhide, its leather stained dark with use, Sarah looked desperately into the crowd, searching for one sympathetic face, one person willing to stand against this public brutality. She found only averted eyes and the cowardly silence of good people choosing survival over honor. The sharp crack of hooves on hard-packed earth suddenly cut through the oppressive quiet. Not the thunder of a galloping horse, but the steady, deliberate pace of a rider who saw no need for hurry and feared no one. The crowd parted without being asked, like the Red Sea before Moses revealing a lone horseman on a spotted Appaloosa. The stranger wore a dust-covered duster that had seen better days, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over shadowed features, and a week's worth of silver-streaked beard on a face weathered to leather by sun and wind and hard living. A Colt single-action army revolver hung at his hip, its walnut grip worn smooth by years of use. The word "justice" had been etched into the grip, the letters darkened by years of sweat and gun oil and perhaps blood. The rider's ice-blue eyes surveyed the scene without expression, taking in every detail with the methodical assessment of a man accustomed to violent situations. His gaze fell on Sarah's torn dress and bloody lip, moved to the Graysons with their air of casual brutality, and finally settled on Ezekiel with the weight of old recognition. "That's far enough, Elijah." The voice was quiet, graveled by years and tobacco and hard words, but it carried across the square like thunder rolling over the plains. Elijah's hand froze, the rawhide dangling forgotten. "Who the hell are you two? The lady keeps her clothes and her dignity." The rider dismounted in a single fluid motion that belied his 55 years, moving with the controlled grace of a man who'd spent decades staying alive in dangerous places. He removed his duster and approached Sarah with long, measured strides, never taking his eyes off the Graysons. With surprising gentleness, he draped the coat around her shoulders, the garment still warm from his body, and carrying the scents of horse leather, gunpowder, and pine smoke. "Ma'am," he said, simply tipping his hat. Sarah clutched the garment around herself, inhaling deeply of those reassuring masculine scents. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ezekiel Grayson's face had gone pale beneath his tan, his remaining hand white-knuckled on the reins. When he spoke, the name sounded like a curse on his lips. Daniel Carter. Recognition flashed in Sarah's mind. Daniel Carter, former territorial governor of Kansas, the man whose reputation had traveled even to Boston drawing rooms. Stories of a lawman who'd brought justice to the lawless frontier, who'd personally hanged 5 members of the notorious James Younger gang. Some called him a hero. Others whispered he was a cold-blooded killer who hid behind a badge. "I heard you'd skulked into Wyoming territory." Ezekiel continued, his voice tight with old hatred. "Not skulking, Ezekiel. Carter replied, his hand resting casually near his holster. Just living quiet. His pale eyes never wavered. Appears quiet living is impossible with you around. This isn't your concern, Carter. But there was something different in Ezekiel's voice, now caution, perhaps even fear. This woman's property is hers by legal right. Carter said with quiet finality. I was at the land office when she filed the deed 3 months back. Everything proper and witnessed. Sarah looked at him in surprise. She didn't remember seeing him there, but then she'd been so overwhelmed by grief and the complexities of frontier bureaucracy. I make it a point to know who owns what in this territory. Carter said, as if reading her thoughts. Helps avoid misunderstandings. Elijah took a step forward, hand dropping to his saber. You can't stop us from... I can... Carter cut him off with quiet authority. And I will. His duster now hung around Sarah's shoulders, leaving his holster clearly visible. Ladies coming with me. You boys ride on home. This isn't over. Ezekiel hissed, his cultured mask slipping to reveal the venom beneath. Never figured it would be. Carter replied mildly. He turned to Sarah, his expression softening slightly. Ma'am, my horse is yours if you'd care to ride. Your home isn't safe right now. Sarah hesitated only a moment. Whatever this man's motive staying in town meant death or worse at the Graysons' hands. She nodded, allowing him to help her onto the Appaloosa. The saddle leather was warm and well-worn comfortable, despite her unfamiliarity with riding astride rather than side saddle. Hold the reins easy. Carter instructed, adjusting the stirrups for her shorter legs. I'll walk alongside. As they moved away from the town square, Sarah glanced back at the Graysons. Ezekiel's face was a mask of barely controlled rage, his plans thwarted by this unexpected intervention. But it was Noah's expression that caught her attention, a mixture of shame and something that might have been relief, as if he were grateful someone had finally stood up to his father's brutality. They'll come after us, she said quietly once they'd cleared the main street. Yes, ma'am, they will. Carter didn't look up as he guided the horse down the dusty street, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. But not today. Ezekiel's many things, but he isn't stupid. He knows my reputation. You're Daniel Carter, the hanging judge of Kansas. A muscle twitched in his weathered cheek. That's a name newspapers gave me. Never cared for it myself. I remember you now, Sarah said suddenly. Not from the land office, from Henderson's general store. You were buying coffee when I first arrived in town with William. You tipped your hat to me. Carter's eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. I remember. Why help me now? He walked several paces in silence. The only sounds the soft clip-clop of the Appaloosa's hooves and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I've watched the Graysons take and take since I settled here 6 months ago. Seen them run off homesteaders, intimidate shopkeepers, threaten anyone who stands against them. He glanced up at her. Sometimes a man has to draw a line in the sand. They passed the town limits, heading north toward the foothills, where the distant mountains rose like purple promises against the vast Wyoming sky. The landscape opened up before them, endless rolling prairie dotted with sage and buffalo grass, broken by occasional stands of cottonwood that marked the presence of water. Where are we going? Sarah asked, beginning to feel the weight of her decision to trust this stranger. My place. 15 miles north along the Powder River. Not much to look at, but it's defensible. The word choice wasn't lost on her. You're expecting trouble. Trouble's been brewing since the war ended. Carter replied grimly. Some men can't accept that the world's changed, that their way of life is gone forever. His eyes briefly flicked to the distant horizon. Your husband's land, it's more valuable than you might realize. It's just a small homestead with some grazing land. It sits at the headwaters of 3 creeks that feed half the county. Control those water rights, and you control who gets to raise cattle, who gets access to the railroad when it comes through." He glanced up at her. "There's also a small gold deposit on the North Ridge." Sarah stared at him in shock. Gold William never mentioned, probably didn't know. Or maybe he did and kept it quiet, trying to protect you. Carter's expression revealed nothing. Either way, the Graysons want that land, and they don't much care how they get it. They walked in silence for nearly an hour, the sun beating down mercilessly on the open prairie. Sarah's thoughts spun like dust devils, trying to process everything that had happened. Had William deliberately put them in the Graysons' crosshairs? Had he known about the gold, the strategic importance of their little homestead? "How do you know so much about my land?" she asked finally. Carter adjusted his hat against the glare. "Told you I make it my business to know who owns what and where. Information keeps a man alive out here. Are you still a lawman?" The question hung in the air between them like gun smoke. Carter's stride never faltered, but something in his shoulders tightened. "No, ma'am. Just a rancher now. Left that life behind in Kansas." But there was something in his voice, a hollowness, that suggested the past wasn't as far behind as he claimed. The Carter Ranch appeared first as a dark smudge against the landscape, gradually resolving into the shape of a fortress-like homestead as they approached. Sarah had seen many frontier dwellings in her 3 months in Wyoming, but nothing quite like this. The main house was built of thick pine logs, chinked with mud and moss, its windows small, and positioned to provide defensive fields of fire. A stone chimney rose from one end, while a covered porch wrapped around 2 sides. The structure was solid permanent, built by a man who intended to stay but expected trouble. A barn corral and several outbuildings formed a rough square around a central courtyard, all positioned to provide cover if needed. Split-rail fences enclosed pastures where a handful of horses grazed peacefully their heads, lifting to study the approaching riders. "You built this place for war," Sarah observed as they entered the yard. Carter helped her down from the Appaloosa, his hands briefly steadying her waist. "Built it to survive out here. Sometimes that's the same thing." Inside the house was spartanly furnished, but clean and well organized. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with gun racks holding Winchester rifles strategically positioned near doors and windows. A wooden table and 4 chairs occupied the center of the room, while shelves lined the walls holding book supplies and the accumulated possessions of a careful man. The only decoration was a framed document hanging beside the fireplace, too far away for Sarah to read, but official-looking with ribbons and seals. "Our bedroom's through there," Carter said, pointing to a side door. "You'll find some clothes in the trunk belong to my mother. Might need taking in, but they'll cover you decent." Thank you," Sarah said suddenly, acutely aware of her state of undress beneath his coat. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." "Not kindness, ma'am. Just what's right." He turned away, giving her privacy. "I'll see to the horses. There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up." The bedroom was as utilitarian as the rest of the house. A narrow bed with a handmade quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small window with heavy shutters that could be barred from inside. The trunk at the foot of the bed contained several dresses of a style 20 years out of date, but made of good, sturdy fabric. Sarah selected a simple brown wool dress and quickly changed, grateful to be properly clothed again. As she folded Carter's coat, her fingers found something in the pocket of folded paper. She hesitated, then extracted it, telling herself she was just checking for anything that might fall out when she returned the garment. The paper was a telegram dated 3 weeks earlier. "Carter, stop Baxter Springs, massacre not forgotten. Stop Egg family searching for you. Stop leave Kansas immediately. Stop." Sarah's hand trembled as she refolded the paper. E.G. Ezekiel Grayson. The telegram warned of something that had happened at Baxter Springs, Kansas. Something that connected Carter to the Graysons, something dangerous enough that someone had warned him to flee. But Carter hadn't fled. He'd come to Wyoming, to the very territory where the Graysons had established themselves as the dominant power. Why? She emerged from the bedroom to find Carter had returned, washing trail dust from his hands in a basin by the door. He glanced up as she appeared in his mother's dress, his expression unreadable. "Fits well enough," was all he said. Sarah handed him his coat. "Thank you again. I've imposed on you enough already. If you could loan me a horse, I should return to my homestead." Carter dried his hands on a towel, then hung his coat on a peg by the door. "Can't do that, ma'am. I beg your pardon. Graysons will be watching your place. You go back there now, you won't last the night." He gestured to a chair at the table. "You'll stay here until we figure something else out. I can't just abandon my home. You won't. But you can't defend it alone, and I can't split myself between two properties." His ice blue eyes met hers. "Sit. You need to eat something." Sarah remained standing, her Boston upbringing asserting itself. "Mr. Carter, while I appreciate your help today, I'm not accustomed to being ordered about by strange men." The faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. "Fair enough. Would you please sit and eat something, Mrs. Miller? You've had a trying day, and hunger won't improve matters." She sat watching as he moved to the stove, where a pot of something aromatic simmered. He ladled stew into 2 bowls and placed one before her, along with a hunk of fresh bread that he must have baked that morning. "It's not fancy," he said, taking the seat opposite her, "but it'll keep body and soul together." The stew was simple venison, potatoes, carrots, but after the day's events, it tasted like the finest meal she'd ever had. They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes before Sarah gathered the courage to ask what was weighing on her mind. "What happened at Baxter Springs?" Carter's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her shiver, despite the warm room. "3 rules while you're here." He said, his voice low and controlled. "Don't go into my room. Don't ask about my past. And if I tell you to do something, do it without question. It might save your life." "I found the telegram in your coat pocket," she admitted. "I wasn't snooping, I was just... Doesn't matter how you found it." He pushed his bowl away, appetite apparently gone. "What matters is understanding your situation. The Graysons want your land, and they'll kill to get it. I can offer you shelter and protection, but not if you're going to pry into matters that don't concern you. Don't concern me." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. "I was publicly humiliated today because of some feud between you and Ezekiel Grayson. My home and life are threatened. How does this not concern me?" Carter stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. He walked to the window, peering through a gap in the heavy curtains, before speaking again. 15 years ago, I was a U.S. Marshal in Kansas Territory. Ezekiel Grayson was funding Confederate guerrilla fighters, Quantrill's raiders, who were terrorizing Union settlements. His voice had gone flat, emotionless. I tracked them to Baxter Springs, but I was too late. He turned to face her, his eyes like blue ice. They massacred the town. 47 civilians, including women and children. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Including my wife and infant son. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "Mr. Carter, I hunted them down." He continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Every last raider. Brought them to justice the legal way, with trials and proper hangings." His jaw tightened. "All except the man who funded them. Ezekiel Grayson disappeared, protected by his money and connections. I spent years looking for him, only to discover he'd established himself here in Wyoming while I was searching elsewhere. So you came here for revenge. I came here for justice." The distinction seemed important to him. "There's a difference." Sarah studied this hard-weathered man who had saved her from humiliation and possible death. A man driven by ghosts and old wounds, who had built a fortress in the wilderness and filled it with guns. "Why help me?" Why not just go after Grayson directly? Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. Because I'm not a murderer, Mrs. Miller. I'm a lawman, or I was. Justice comes through the law, not from the barrel of a gun. He paused, his expression softening slightly. And because no one else in that town square had the courage to stand up for what's right. Before Sarah could respond, a sound cut through the evening air, a high, warbling cry that raised the hair on the back of her neck. Carter was at the window instantly, rifle in hand. Get away from the windows, now. Sarah obeyed without question, pressing herself against the interior wall. What is it? Cheyenne wore cry. Carter's eyes never left the horizon as he scanned the gathering dusk. Someone's watching the ranch. Indians, I thought the army had them under control after Little Bighorn. Not all Cheyenne fought with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Some managed to stay free of the reservations. He adjusted his position slightly. That wasn't a threat, it was a greeting. And it wasn't meant for me. Then who? Carter finally looked at her. You. They're trying to understand why I brought a white woman to my ranch. They're curious. Sarah felt a chill despite the warm evening. Are we in danger? Not from them, not yet. Carter lowered the rifle slightly. But it means we're being watched from all sides now. Grayson's from the south, Cheyenne from the north. What do we do? Carter's expression was grim in the fading light. We prepare. Because when Ezekiel Grayson decides to move against us, he won't come alone, and he won't show mercy. He crossed to a cabinet and unlocked it, revealing an arsenal of weapons rifles, pistols, ammunition, and boxes of cartridges. He selected a Winchester rifle, checking its action before holding it out to her. Do you know how to use this? Sarah hesitated, staring at the weapon. I've never fired a gun in my life. Then your first lesson starts now. He pressed the rifle into her hands, its weight both foreign and strangely reassuring. Because when trouble comes, and it will, I can't defend this place alone. As darkness settled over the Wyoming plains, Sarah Miller, Boston-bred schoolteacher turned frontier widow, held the unfamiliar weight of the rifle, and realized how far she had traveled from the life she'd once known. The civilized world of Boston drawing rooms and afternoon teas seemed as distant as the stars now appearing in the vast western sky. Whatever lay ahead there would be no going back. Dawn broke cold and clear, painting the eastern sky in bands of orange and gold that gradually gave way to the hard blue of another scorching day. Sarah had slept poorly, her dreams filled with Ezekiel Grayson's cold eyes and the sound of Elijah's rawhide cutting the air. She rose and dressed in another of the old-fashioned gowns, this one a faded blue calico that had probably been quite pretty in its day. In the main room, she found Carter already up, coffee boiling on the stove, and the rich aroma filling the small space. We start shooting practice after breakfast, he said without preamble, placing a plate of bacon and biscuits on the table. Need to see if you've got steady hands. Mr. Carter. Daniel, he corrected. If we're going to be dodging bullets together, might as well use given names. Daniel, then. Sarah seated herself at the table. I appreciate your protection, but I can't impose on you indefinitely. I need to return to my homestead, salvage what I can of my life. He sat across from her, his weathered face giving away nothing. The Graysons won't give up Sarah. You understand that, don't you? This isn't just about your land anymore. By standing against them publicly, we've challenged their authority in this territory. Then what do you suggest, that I simply abandon everything William left me? Daniel took a slow sip of coffee, studying her over the rim of his cup. I suggest you learn to shoot first. Then we'll discuss options. After breakfast, they moved to a natural shooting range behind the house where Daniel had set up targets, tin cans arranged on a fallen log about 50 yards distant. The morning air was still cool, carrying the scents of sage and pine from the nearby foothills. First thing, Daniel said, handing her the Winchester. A gun is a tool, nothing more, like a hammer or a plow. Respect it, but don't fear it. He showed her how to hold the rifle properly, how to sight along the barrel, how to control her breathing. Standing close behind her, he guided her arms into position, his chest solid against her back, his hands steady and sure as they positioned hers on the stock. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it. He instructed, his voice quiet in her ear. Let the shot surprise you. Sarah tried to focus on the target rather than the proximity of this man she barely knew. She could smell leather and coffee and something distinctly masculine, not unpleasant, but distracting. The rifle felt heavy and awkward in her hands. The Winchester cracked the recoil, jarring her shoulder and sending the bullet wide of its target. Again, Daniel said calmly, adjusting her grip slightly. Remember, breathe out halfway, then hold it as you squeeze. By midday, Sarah had managed to hit 3 cans, her shoulder aching from the rifle's kick, but her confidence growing with each shot. Daniel nodded approvingly as he cleaned the Winchester. You've got a natural eye, he said. Few more days of practice, you'll be hitting targets at 100 yards. I'm not sure whether to be flattered or horrified that I have a talent for shooting. Sarah replied, massaging her sore shoulder. A ghost of a smile touched Daniel's lips. Out here it's a necessary skill, like riding a horse or starting a fire. As they walked back toward the house, Sarah noticed a dust cloud on the southern horizon, the direction of Cheyenne. Rider coming, she said, pointing. Daniel shaded his eyes, studying the approaching figure. Just one moving fast. Not Grayson's style, he travels with an escort. The horse that galloped into the yard was lathered with sweat, its sides heaving. The rider, an elderly man with wild white hair and wearing a shopkeeper's apron, practically fell from the saddle. Hardened, Daniel said, moving forward to steady the old man. What's happened? Sullivan. The man gasped, clutching Daniel's arm. He's in town. Ezekiel hired him. Even from where she stood, Sarah could see Daniel's posture stiffen. You're certain it's him? Tall man, all in black, wears gloves even in this heat. Has a silver watch chain with a judge's gavel charm hanging from it. Sheridan nodded frantically. It's him, all right. The hangman himself. Daniel's face had gone hard as granite. Get inside, now. Once within the house, Daniel began checking weapons with practiced efficiency, while Sheridan collapsed into a chair, accepting the water Sarah offered with shaking hands. Who is Sullivan? She asked. Bounty hunter, Daniel replied without looking up from his task. Ex-Confederate cavalry. Calls himself the hanging judge as a mockery of actual justice. He doesn't bring men in for trial, he executes them on the spot. He killed Sheriff Dawson this morning. Sheridan added, his voice steadying. Walked right up to him on Main Street, accused him of harboring Union sympathizers, and shot him point blank. Then he pinned the star to his own chest and declared himself the new law in Cheyenne. Daniel checked the action on his Colt, his movements precise and controlled. With Dawson dead, there's no one left to stand against Grayson. He'll have free rein now. There's more, Sheridan said, leaning forward. Sullivan's posted bounties. $500 for you, Daniel, dead or alive. $200 for the woman. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. They've put a price on my head, but I've done nothing except stand up to them. That's enough, Daniel said simply. Sheridan reached into his vest and withdrew a folded paper. Mason at the telegraph office sent this. Said to get it to you immediately. Daniel unfolded the telegram, his expression unchanging as he read. Without a word, he handed it to Sarah. Carter, stop Federal Judge Cooper. Arriving Cheyenne. Stop investigating land fraud and civil rights violations. Stop use extreme caution. Stop Grant. President Grant sent this. Sarah asked, stunned. Ulysses and I served together during the war, Daniel said as casually as if discussing the weather. He knows I've been tracking Grayson's activities for years. 100 questions raced through Sarah's mind, but before she could voice any of them, a sharp crack split the air. Sheridan jerked in his seat, a red stain blossoming across his chest. The window behind him had shattered glass tinkling to the floor like deadly rain. "Down!" Daniel shouted, tackling Sarah to the floor as another shot splintered the doorframe where she'd been standing. "Sniper," Daniel said, crawling toward the nearest window. Southwest corner behind the rock outcropping. Sarah peered carefully around the edge of another window, Winchester ready. In the distance, she could make out the glint of metal among the rocks, a rifle barrel catching the afternoon sun. "I see him," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can you make the shot?" The target was at least 300 yards away, far beyond anything they'd practiced. "I don't think so." "Then keep your head down. He's trying to pin us here while others move in closer." Daniel was moving from window to window, checking all approaches to the house. Sheridan slumped in his chair, blood pooling beneath him. The old shopkeeper had died trying to warn them another innocent caught in the crossfire of this deadly feud. "There," Daniel said, pointing toward the eastern approach. 3 riders coming fast." Sarah positioned herself at a window rifle braced against the sill. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she sighted along the barrel, remembering Daniel's instructions. The riders were closing rapidly, dust billowing behind their horses. 200 yards. 150, 100. "On my mark," Daniel said from his position at another window. "Take the one on the left." Sarah centered her sights on the leftmost rider, a man in a black duster with a red bandana covering the lower half of his face. Her finger found the trigger, applied gentle pressure. "Now," Daniel commanded. Their rifles cracked in unison. The rider Sarah had targeted jerked backward, toppling from his horse. Daniel's shot found the middle rider, who slumped forward but remained mounted his horse, continuing its charge. The third rider, seeing his companions hit, veered sharply away, seeking cover behind a nearby gully. "Reload," Daniel ordered, already working the lever action on his Winchester. Sarah fumbled with the cartridges, her earlier calm giving way to shaking hands as the reality of what she'd just done hit her. She had shot a man, possibly killed him. She who had never harmed anyone in her life, who couldn't bear to see even a spider killed. "Sarah!" Daniel's voice cut through her rising panic. "Stay focused. They're regrouping." Indeed, more riders had emerged from concealment, at least 6 now, spreading out to approach the ranch from multiple angles. "They're trying to surround us," Daniel said, his voice clinically detached. "We need to fall back to the barn. Better position, and there's a tunnel if we need an escape route." "Tunnel?" "Dug it last winter. Connects the house to the barn, then to a cave system in the hills. Never know when you might need a back door." A volley of shots peppered the front of the house, splintering wood and shattering another window. Sarah ducked instinctively as glass shards rained down around her. "Move." Daniel commanded, firing twice more to provide covering fire. Back door straight to the barn. Sarah ran heart-pounding, expecting at any moment to feel the burn of a bullet between her shoulder blades. The distance to the barn seemed impossibly vast, though it couldn't have been more than 30 yards. She reached the barn door, yanked it open, and dove inside, just as Daniel backed in, after her still firing methodically at their attackers. "Bar the door," he instructed, moving to a ladder that led to the hayloft. "Then get up here." From the elevated position, they had a commanding view of the yard between house and barn. Sarah counted the riders, 7 now, circling the property at a cautious distance, like wolves around wounded prey. "What do we do?" she asked, trying to control her breathing. "Wait. They won't risk a frontal assault on the barn, too exposed, crossing that open ground." Daniel glanced at her. "You did well down there. First time in a real fight, and you kept your head." "I killed a man." She said the words feeling strange on her tongue. "You defended yourself," Daniel corrected. "There's a difference." Before Sarah could respond, a new sound reached them, a high, ululating cry that echoed across the plains. The same Cheyenne war call she'd heard the previous evening, but multiplied now, coming from multiple directions. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. Well now, looks like we have new players in this game. From the north, a dozen mounted warriors appeared, their horses kicking up dust as they rode hard toward the ranch. They carried rifles alongside traditional bows, their faces painted for war in stark patterns of red and black. 2 hawks, Daniel said with recognition. Cheyenne war chief. I helped his people once when army patrols were giving them trouble. Are they here to help us? Maybe. Or maybe they're just taking advantage of the situation to settle their own scores with white men. Daniel continued watching as the Cheyenne warriors closed the distance. Either way, it's about to get very interesting down there. The attackers had turned to face this new threat, clearly caught off guard. They regrouped hastily, forming a defensive line as the Cheyenne swept in like a prairie storm. The battle was brief, but savage. The Cheyenne fought with the fluid tactics of mounted warfare, perfected over generations, circling their enemies while firing with deadly accuracy from horseback. Within minutes, 3 of the attackers were down, the survivors retreating toward the gully in disarray. Now's our chance, Daniel said, already moving toward the ladder. While they're occupied with each other, they descended quickly. Daniel leading the way to the tunnel entrance. He'd mentioned a concealed trap door beneath hay bales in the corner of the barn. It's a tight fit, he warned, lifting the heavy wooden panel. But it'll get us to the cave system. From there we can work our way into the hills. The tunnel was narrow and dark, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. Sarah fought down a wave of claustrophobia as she crawled forward on hands and knees, Daniel close behind her. Behind them, the sounds of battle continued: gunfire, war cries, the screams of wounded men and horses. They emerged from the tunnel in a small cave that opened onto a rocky slope overlooking the ranch. From this vantage point, they could see the aftermath of the fight. Bodies littered the yard, both attackers and several Cheyenne warriors who had paid the ultimate price for their intervention. 2 Hawks himself sat his horse in the center of the carnage, surveying the scene with grim satisfaction. As Sarah watched, he raised his rifle above his head and let out a victory cry that echoed off the surrounding hills. We owe him our lives, Sarah said quietly. Daniel nodded. And he knows it. 2 Hawks doesn't forget debts or favors. As if sensing their presence, the war chief turned and looked directly at their hiding place. Even at this distance, Sarah could see him nod once before, wheeling his horse around and leading his surviving warriors away from the ranch. Where do we go now? Sarah asked. Daniel studied the surrounding terrain, his strategic mind already working. There's an old trapper's cabin about 10 miles north. We can hole up there, figure out our next move. And Judge Cooper, if he's still alive and coming to Cheyenne, we need to reach him before Sullivan does. Daniel's expression was grim. Because if Sullivan gets to him first, our last hope for legal justice dies with him. As they prepared to leave their sanctuary, Sarah took one last look at the ranch that had briefly been her refuge. Smoke rose from several buildings, and she could see bodies scattered across the yard, the price of standing against men like Ezekiel Grayson. But they were alive, and they were free. For now, that would have to be enough. The old trapper's cabin squatted like a weathered sentinel in a grove of aspen trees, its log walls chinked with moss and mud, its roof sagging but intact. Smoke trickled from the stone chimney, and light glowed warmly in the single window signs that the cabin was occupied. Daniel approached cautiously, his Winchester ready, while Sarah remained hidden among the trees. After their ordeal at the ranch, neither was inclined to trust unexpected hospitality. Hello, the cabin, Daniel called out using the traditional frontier greeting. The door opened to reveal a tall, distinguished man in his 60s, with a shock of white hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He wore a travel-stained suit that had seen better days, and his left arm was supported by a makeshift sling. Are you Daniel Carter? The man asked. Depends who's asking. Judge James Cooper, Federal Circuit Court. The man stepped into the doorway, wincing slightly from what appeared to be a wound in his side. "I believe we have mutual friends in Washington." Daniel lowered his rifle slightly. "You're supposed to be in Cheyenne. I was ambushed 20 miles south of here. My escort was killed and I took a bullet in the ribs." Cooper gestured to his makeshift bandage. "I managed to reach this cabin, but I won't be traveling any further without help." Sarah emerged from the trees, her appearance causing Cooper to raise his eyebrows. "Mrs. Miller, I presume I've heard about your difficulties with the Grayson family. How do you know my name? Your situation is part of why I'm here, ma'am. Reports of land fraud, intimidation, and civil rights violations have reached Washington. President Grant takes such matters seriously, particularly when they involve veterans' widows." Daniel studied the judge carefully. "How do we know you're who you claim to be?" Cooper reached slowly into his coat pocket, producing an official-looking document. "Presidential commission signed by Grant himself. I have full authority to investigate federal crimes and convene tribunals anywhere in the territory." Daniel examined the papers, his expression gradually relaxing as he recognized the seals and signatures. "These look genuine." "They are. Now, may I suggest we continue this conversation inside? I'm feeling rather exposed out here, and I suspect we have much to discuss." Inside the cabin, Cooper had made himself as comfortable as possible. Medical supplies and bandages were spread on the rough table, along with official documents and what appeared to be a telegraph key. Somehow he'd managed to establish communication with the outside world. "I've been in contact with my office in Denver," Cooper explained, settling carefully into a chair. "They know my location and status. If I don't report in within 3 days, federal marshals will flood this territory." 3 days may be too late," Daniel replied grimly. "Sullivan's taken control of Cheyenne. He's posted bounties on our heads and declared himself the local law." Cooper's face darkened. "Samuel Sullivan. Yes, I'm familiar with his reputation. A deserter who turned gun for hire after the war. He's wanted on federal charges in 3 territories. Then you can arrest him. I can authorize his arrest, but I need evidence of specific crimes committed within my jurisdiction." Cooper looked meaningfully at both of them. "Eyewitness testimony from reliable sources, for instance." Sarah felt a surge of hope. "We've seen him commit murder. He killed Sheriff Dawson in cold blood right on Main Street. And we can provide evidence of Grayson's land fraud," Daniel added. "Financial records, falsified deeds, witness testimony about his intimidation tactics." Cooper nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what I need. But first, we have to survive long enough to present it. Sullivan won't hesitate to kill a federal judge if he thinks he can get away with it." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Daniel was at the window, instantly peering through a gap in the curtains. 6 riders, he reported, moving careful-like surrounding the cabin. Cooper struggled to his feet, grimacing with pain. "Sullivan. Can't tell from here, but I'd wager on it." Daniel checked his weapons. Sarah helped the judge gather his papers. "We may need to move fast." The sound of boots on the wooden porch preceded a sharp knock on the door. A voice called out, cultured, southern-accented, mockingly polite. "Judge Cooper, I know you're in there. I'm Ezekiel Grayson, and I'd like to have a word with you." Cooper's eyes widened. "He's here personally. That's either very good or very bad for us." "Mr. Grayson." Cooper called through the door. "I'm a federal judge on official business. Any interference with my duties is a serious crime." "Oh, I have no intention of interfering with your duties, Your Honor." Ezekiel's voice carried false warmth. "I merely wish to present my side of certain misunderstandings that may have been reported to you." Daniel shook his head grimly. "It's a trap. He's trying to get you to open the door." But Cooper surprised them both by moving toward the entrance. "Sometimes, Mr. Carter, you have to take calculated risks in the name of justice." He paused with his hand on the latch. "Be ready to move if this goes badly." Cooper opened the door to reveal Ezekiel Grayson standing alone on the porch, though Sarah could see armed men positioned around the cabin. The former Confederate colonel had exchanged his usual black coat for more practical traveling clothes, but his bearing remained aristocratic, commanding. "Your Honor," Ezekiel said with a formal bow, "I apologize for disturbing your rest, but urgent matters require your attention, such as false accusations made against me by desperate individuals seeking to profit from my family's tragic circumstances." Ezekiel's voice carried wounded dignity. "You see, Judge Cooper, I am the victim here, a war-damaged veteran, trying to build an honest life in this harsh territory, beset by criminals and northern carpetbaggers." Cooper listened with the patience of a man accustomed to hearing all sides of a dispute. "I'm willing to hear your version of events, Mr. Grayson. But first, perhaps you could explain why you've surrounded this cabin with armed men." "On protection, Your Honor. The individuals making these false claims against me are violent and dangerous. I feared for your safety." "How thoughtful." Cooper's tone was dry. "And where is Sheriff Dawson? I was expecting to meet with local law enforcement." Ezekiel's mask slipped slightly. "Poor Dawson met with an unfortunate accident this morning. A tragic loss for our community. An accident involving Mr. Sullivan's pistol, I believe." The silence stretched taut as piano wire. Ezekiel's remaining hand moved slowly toward his holstered weapon. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "I think there may have been some miscommunication about recent events in Cheyenne." "No miscommunication at all." Cooper's voice hardened. "I know exactly what kind of man you are, Ezekiel Grayson. I know about Baxter Springs, about Quantrill's raiders, about the blood money you paid for massacring innocent civilians." Ezekiel's facade crumbled entirely, revealing the cold killer beneath. "Then you also know that dead men tell no tales, Judge Cooper." His hand darted for his pistol, but Daniel was faster. The Winchester cracked, and Ezekiel stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. Before he could recover, shouts erupted from around the cabin as his men opened fire. "Back room," Cooper commanded, surprisingly agile, despite his wound. "There's a root cellar with a tunnel." They fought their way through the cabin, as bullets shattered windows and splintered wood around them. Sarah fired the rifle Daniel had given her, no longer hesitating to shoot at men trying to kill them. The moral complexity of taking human life had been stripped away by the simple necessity of survival. Cooper led them to a concealed trap door in the cabin's back room. "Goes to a natural cave system," he explained as they descended into darkness. "Trappers used it to cache their furs. The tunnel was rough-hewn and narrow, carved from living rock by water and time." They moved by feel, Cooper's intimate knowledge of the passage suggesting he'd explored it thoroughly during his stay at the cabin. Behind them, they could hear Grayson's men searching the cabin, their angry shouts indicating they'd discovered the escape route. But the tunnel had multiple branches, and in the darkness, pursuit would be nearly impossible. They emerged from a cave mouth, hidden among a jumble of boulders on a hillside half a mile from the cabin. Below them, they could see smoke rising from the structure. Grayson's men had set it ablaze in their frustration. "Well," Cooper said, breathing heavily from the exertion, "that went about as well as I expected." "You expected this?" Sarah asked incredulously. "Mrs. Miller, I've been a frontier judge for 20 years. I've learned to read men like Ezekiel Grayson. He was never going to let me leave that cabin alive, no matter what he said." Cooper studied the burning building below. "But now, we have eyewitness testimony to attempted murder of a federal judge. That's a hanging offense even in territorial court. First, we have to live long enough to testify," Daniel pointed out, "and find a court that isn't in Grayson's pocket." Cooper smiled grimly. "Leave that to me, Mr. Carter. I have resources you might not be aware of." As if on cue, the sound of a bugle echoed across the valley, the cavalry charge clear and unmistakable in the evening air. "Right on schedule," Cooper murmured with satisfaction. A full troop of cavalry poured into the valley, their blue uniforms bright in the fading light. At their head rode a young lieutenant with the earnest bearing of a man who took his duty seriously. "Now that would be Lieutenant Morrison," Cooper explained. "I telegraphed Fort Laramie before Grayson arrived. Federal judges rate military protection when threatened." The cavalry engagement was brief but decisive. Caught in the open and outnumbered, Grayson's men had little choice but to surrender. Sarah watched from their hillside perch as soldiers rounded up the surviving attackers, including a wounded but defiant Ezekiel Grayson. "Is it over?" she asked. "This part," Daniel replied. "But Sullivan's still out there, and he won't give up easily." Cooper was already making his way down the hillside toward the cavalry troop. "Come along. We have a trial to prepare for." The town hall in Cheyenne had been hastily converted into a courtroom with rough benches for spectators and a table serving as the judge's bench. Word of the federal tribunal had spread quickly, and the building was packed beyond capacity with settlers, ranchers, soldiers, and anyone else curious to see Ezekiel Grayson finally brought to justice. Judge Cooper presided with the authority of federal law behind him, his wounded arm in a proper sling, but his bearing still commanding. To his right sat a court recorder, frantically scribbling notes as the proceedings unfolded. To his left, Lieutenant Morrison and several soldiers maintained order in the crowded room. Ezekiel Grayson sat at the defendant's table, his shoulder bandaged, but his bearing still aristocratic despite his circumstances. He'd refused legal counsel, declaring that he would represent himself against these trumped-up charges by carpetbaggers and scalawags. The prosecution was led by Judge Cooper himself, an unusual arrangement, but perfectly legal under territorial law. His first witness was Daniel Carter. "State your name and occupation for the record," Cooper instructed. "Daniel Carter, former U.S. Marshal, former territorial governor of Kansas." A murmur ran through the crowd. Daniel's reputation had preceded him, and his presence lent gravity to the proceedings. "Mr. Carter, please tell the court about your history with the defendant." Daniel's testimony was methodical and devastating. He recounted the Baxter Springs massacre, Grayson's role in funding Quantrill's raiders, the systematic campaign of terror against Union settlements in Kansas. His voice never wavered, never showed the emotion that must have been boiling beneath the surface. "And what brought you to Wyoming territory, Mr. Carter?" "I learned that Ezekiel Grayson had established himself here under an assumed identity, continuing the same pattern of fraud and intimidation he'd practiced in Kansas." Grayson's face darkened with each word, but he remained silent, saving his defense for cross-examination. Sarah testified next, describing her husband's death, her attempted humiliation in the town square, the systematic campaign to drive her from her legal homestead. Her voice was steady, her demeanor dignified, despite the crude surroundings and hostile stares from some of Grayson's remaining supporters. "Mrs. Miller," Cooper asked, "in your opinion, would the defendant have carried out his threats against you?" "Without hesitation, Your Honor. I believe he would have killed me rather than let me keep land he considered rightfully his." Judge Cooper called several other witnesses, frightened homesteaders who testified to Grayson's strong-arm tactics, the telegraph operator who confirmed threatening messages, even Two Hawks, the Cheyenne war chief, who spoke through an interpreter about Sullivan's depredations against his people. When the prosecution rested, Grayson rose to present his defense. He was an eloquent speaker, his cultured voice and aristocratic bearing lending weight to his words as he painted himself as a victim of northern persecution. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, "you see before you a broken man, a veteran who lost everything in service to his beliefs, who came west seeking only to rebuild his life in honest toil. Instead, I found myself beset by carpetbaggers and criminals, by savage Indians and corrupt officials who sought to profit from my family's misfortunes. He wove a compelling narrative of Southern victimhood of a proud family brought low by the vindictive policies of Reconstruction. Some in the audience nodded sympathetically. There were Confederate veterans among them who understood the pain of defeat and displacement. But Cooper had chosen his jury carefully, and Grayson's words fell on increasingly deaf ears as the evidence mounted against him. Financial records showed payments to Sullivan for services rendered. Falsified deeds bore Grayson's signature. Witness after witness testified to his threats and violence. The trial's climax came when Sullivan himself was brought into the courtroom in shackles. The bounty hunter had been captured trying to flee the territory, and Cooper had offered him a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony against his former employer. Sullivan's account was damning. He described in clinical detail the murders he'd committed on Grayson's orders, the intimidation campaigns, the systematic effort to seize control of Wyoming's most valuable land and water rights. Why? Cooper asked. What was Grayson's ultimate goal? To build a new Confederacy. Sullivan replied matter-of-factly. He wanted to recreate the old plantation system out here with himself as the feudal lord and everyone else as his vassals. The war may have ended back east, but Ezekiel Grayson never stopped fighting it. Grayson's face had gone pale during Sullivan's testimony, his carefully constructed facade crumbling as his former ally revealed the full scope of his ambitions. When Cooper asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Grayson rose slowly to his feet. For a moment, Sarah thought he might show remorse, might acknowledge the pain he'd caused. Instead, his eyes found hers across the courtroom, burning with undiminished hatred. This territory was built by strong men, willing to take what they needed. He said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. The weak deserve what they get. Judge Cooper's expression was granite hard as he pronounced sentence. Ezekiel Grayson, you have been found guilty of conspiracy, murder, fraud, and treason against the United States. You are sentenced to hang by the neck until dead sentence to be carried out at dawn tomorrow. A cheer went up from some in the crowd, while others sat in stunned silence. The speed of frontier justice still shocked those accustomed to the lengthy appeals process of Eastern courts. Sullivan received a similar sentence, his cooperation earning him nothing but a few extra hours of life. As the prisoners were led away, Sarah felt no triumph, no sense of vindication. Only a profound weariness and the knowledge that while justice had been served, it could never bring back the dead or heal all the wounds that had been inflicted. Dawn broke clear and cold over Cheyenne, painting the sky in soft pastels that seemed incongruous with the grim business at hand. A gallows had been constructed overnight at the edge of town, a simple but sturdy affair of rough-hewn timber, its crossbeam casting a stark shadow in the growing light. Sarah stood apart from the crowd that had gathered to witness the execution. Daniel beside her, both wrapped in heavy coats against the pre-dawn chill. Neither had slept much. The imminent culmination of their long struggle had kept rest at bay. 15 years, Daniel said quietly, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. 15 years I've waited for this moment. And now? Sarah asked, studying his profile against the lightening sky. Now I wonder if it will change anything. Will my wife and son rest easier? Will the nightmares stop? His voice held a note she hadn't heard before, not doubt exactly, but a questioning that suggested the possibility of peace. Sarah slipped her hand into his, a gesture that would have been scandalous in Boston, but felt right in this moment. Justice isn't about erasing the past. It's about making the future possible. He looked down at their joined hands, then at her face. What future do you see, Sarah Miller? Before she could answer, a murmur ran through the crowd as the prisoners were led to the gallows. Both men walked with dignity, Grayson maintaining his aristocratic bearing. But even in his final moments, Sullivan silent and grim-faced. The execution proceeded with somber efficiency. No speeches, no last-minute confessions or pleas for mercy, just the mechanical process of justice being served. When it was done, When both men hung side by side in the growing light of dawn, Sarah felt no triumph, only a profound sense of closure. The crowd dispersed quickly, most heading to the warmth of homes and businesses, now that the spectacle was over. Sarah and Daniel remained still, hand in hand, watching as soldiers began the process of removing the bodies. "You never answered my question," Daniel said eventually, "about what future you see." Sarah considered her response carefully. "I see Wyoming, not as Ezekiel Grayson envisioned it, a kingdom built on fear and oppression, but as it could be. A place where settlers and tribes can coexist, where the law protects everyone, not just the powerful." "Ambitious," Daniel observed, though not dismissively. "I learned from the best," she replied with a small smile. "A certain stubborn marshal who spent 15 years pursuing justice against impossible odds." They began walking back toward town, and their pace unhurried. The weight of immediate danger had lifted, allowing them to notice details that had been irrelevant during their flight, and the beauty of the mountains against the morning sky. The scent of sage carried on the breeze, the simple pleasure of walking side by side without fear. "I meant what I said about the valley and the Tetons," Daniel said as they reached the edge of town. "Most beautiful place God ever made." He glanced at her uncharacteristic uncertainty in his expression. "I have a small claim there. Good water, good grazing room to build something lasting." Sarah's heart quickened at the implied invitation. "Are you asking me to accompany you, Mr. Carter?" "I'm suggesting," he replied carefully, "that neither of us has much tying us to our old lives. That we've seen the worst and best of each other these past days, and that I find myself reluctant to say goodbye." It wasn't a declaration of love. Daniel Carter wasn't a man for flowery sentiments, but in its straightforward honesty, it was perhaps more meaningful than any poetic profession. "I'd like to see this valley," Sarah said, matching his practical tone, though her eyes conveyed deeper emotions. "After all, I've come to appreciate the Wyoming landscape. It would be a shame to leave without seeing its finest feature." A genuine smile touched Daniel's lips, reaching his ice-blue eyes and transforming his weathered face. "It's settled then. We'll head north once we've tied up the legal loose ends here." As they continued toward the boarding house, where they'd been staying during the trial, Sarah reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. From Boston society matron to frontier widow, from victim to survivor, from a woman seeking rescue to one who had found her own strength, Wyoming territory had nearly killed her. It had also, in a profound way, given her life. "You know," she said, pausing at the boarding house gate, "William brought me west with promises of a better life." It wasn't what he described, but perhaps he was right after all. Daniel's hand tightened around hers, a silent acknowledgement of all they had endured and all that might yet be. Together, they stepped forward to greet their future, whatever it might hold. A future where justice had been served and new beginnings were possible. A future where the law of the West would protect all who sought honest lives beneath its vast and unforgiving sky. 6 months later, the valley in the Tetons was everything Daniel had promised and more. Snow-capped peaks rose like cathedral spires around a meadow carpeted with wildflowers, while a crystal-clear stream wound through stands of aspen and pine. The cabin they'd built together was modest, but solid, with a view that took Sarah's breath away every morning. She stood on the porch now, watching Daniel work with the horses in the corral he'd built below the house. Her hands rested on the gentle swell of her belly, a new life growing within her, conceived in love rather than duty. At 39, she'd thought her chance for motherhood had passed. But Wyoming seemed to specialize in second chances. A rider appeared on the trail from the south, and Sarah shaded her eyes to identify the visitor. As the figure drew closer, she recognized Noah Grayson, looking healthier and more at peace than she'd ever seen him. "Mrs. Carter," he called, dismounting at the corral. The name still sounded strange to her ears. She and Daniel had married in a simple ceremony in Cheyenne before heading north, but she was growing accustomed to it. "Noah," she greeted him warmly. "It's good to see you. How are things in California?" "Prospering beyond my wildest dreams," he replied with a grin. "Turns out there's good money to be made in legitimate business when you're not constantly looking over your shoulder." Daniel emerged from the corral, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Noah, what brings you back to Wyoming?" "Two things," Noah said, pulling a newspaper from his saddlebags. "First, I thought you'd want to see this." The headline made Sarah gasp. "Federal Marshal shot down Sullivan Gang in Colorado Territory." The article described how a group of ex-Confederate raiders calling themselves Sullivan's Riders had been wiped out while attempting to rob a bank in Denver. Their leader, claiming to be the son of the executed Samuel Sullivan, had died in the gunfight. "The last of them," Daniel said with satisfaction. "It's finally over." The second thing, Noah continued producing an official-looking document, "is this deed to your old homestead, Mrs. Carter. The territorial government ruled that all of my father's seizures were illegal. The land reverts to you free and clear." Sarah took the deed with trembling hands. The property that had started this whole deadly affair was finally legally, irrevocably hers. "I don't know what to say," she managed. "Say you'll put it to good use," Noah suggested. "There's talk of the railroad coming through that area. The right person could build something lasting there, a town maybe where all kinds of people could make an honest living." "Miller's Crossing," Daniel said thoughtfully, "has a nice ring to it." They invited Noah to stay for dinner, and as the sun set behind the peaks, they sat on the porch sharing stories and planning for the future. The young man had changed dramatically since his father's death. With the burden of the Grayson legacy no longer weighing him down, he discovered he had both conscience and courage. "I heard from Morning Star last month," Noah mentioned as they watched the stars emerge in the clear mountain air. "She and what's left of Two Hawks' band have been granted a permanent reservation in the Powder River country. Good hunting grounds, and the government's promise to leave them alone as long as they keep the peace. They've earned it," Daniel said quietly. "Two Hawks saved our lives more than once." "She asked me to give you this," Noah added, pulling a small beaded pouch from his coat. "Said it was a gift for the new baby." Sarah accepted the gift with emotion, threatening to overwhelm her. Inside the pouch was a tiny pair of beaded moccasins, clearly made for an infant, along with a small piece of paper bearing a message in Morning Star's careful handwriting. "For the child who will grow up in a world where justice lives. May they walk in beauty all their days." Later, after Noah had bedded down in the barn for the night, Sarah and Daniel sat together on their porch, her head on his shoulder, as they listened to the night sounds of the mountains, the soft hooting of owls, the distant call of wolves, the whisper of wind through pine needles. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving up the marshal's life, settling down with a pregnant widow in the middle of nowhere." Daniel's arm tightened around her. "Never. For the first time in 15 years, I sleep through the night without nightmares. That's worth more than any badge or reputation." "And you?" he asked. "Any regrets about leaving Boston society behind?" Sarah laughed softly, thinking of the elaborate rules and restrictions that had once governed her life. "None whatsoever. I'd rather face a dozen Ezekiel Graysons than another afternoon tea with the Beacon Hill ladies." They sat in comfortable silence, watching shooting stars streak across the vast Wyoming sky. In the distance, a coyote howled, not a threatening sound, but simply a part of the wilderness music that had become the soundtrack to their new life. "What do you think our child will make of all this?" Sarah asked, her hand moving to her belly. "I think," Daniel said slowly, "they'll grow up free. Free to choose their own path, to make their own mistakes, to build something better than what came before." His voice softened. "That's the best gift we can give them, freedom to be better than we were." The baby kicked as if in agreement, and Sarah smiled in the darkness. Wyoming had taken much from her, her husband, her innocence, her comfortable illusions about how the world worked. But it had given her something far more valuable in return, and the knowledge that she could survive anything, that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, that love could bloom even in the harshest soil. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There was a town to build, a railroad to negotiate, with a future to shape for the generations that would follow. But tonight, in this perfect valley, with the man she loved and the child they'd created together, Sarah Miller Carter was content to simply be alive, to be free to be home. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow comforting in their constancy. The Wyoming territory spread out below them in all its harsh beauty, a land that demanded everything from those who would claim it, but rewarded those brave enough to meet its challenges with a freedom found nowhere else on earth. In the morning, they would begin building their town, their future, their legacy. But for now, they simply held each other beneath the infinite sky, two survivors who'd found something worth fighting for in each other, and in the wild, unforgiving, magnificent land they now called home.